Hello, everyone, to another Dr. Spotfire um, monthly meeting. This is Jose Aguirre from TIPCO, and here I have with me Mathew Stahl. Mathew, you want to say hi to our audience?
Hello, everyone.
Perfect. So today we're going to present extending Spotfire with the SDK. So the SDK is a software development kit, and it's a very powerful way to extend Spotfire functionality. Enables developers to create custom extensions, integration with the Spotfire platform, include custom data connectors, visualizations, and more. And in this session, we're going to showcase what is possible with the SDK with real life examples. Not necessarily we're going to go in deep into the technical aspects on how to set up a development environments and so forth, but it's more like an introduction on what's capable. And for that, we have Mathew from Glysade, and he's been using the Spotfire SDK very extensively in the life science industry. Let's go to the next slide. And just as a reminder, our slogan here at Dr. Spotfire is that learning is not driven by answers, but by questions. So please keep the questions coming, not only during these live sessions, but also offline. This is a key learning, because when we focus only on finding the right answer, we're just simply trying to memorize information or recall something that we previously learned. However, when we ask questions, we are actively engaging our minds in the process of exploring and discovering new information. So again, the process of learning is not just about getting the right answers, but also to ask questions. So please don't hesitate on asking any questions, so we can engage the process of exploration and discovery. This session is streaming live in Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and it's going to be available to watch later. If you find it hard to read the screen on LinkedIn, just try to switch to YouTube and in hopes of better quality. If not, you can always watch this video later. So don't forget to subscribe for new and upcoming sessions. Remember that Spotfire are held live the first Tuesday of every month at 9 a.m. Pacific. And to find more about the next or past sessions, just search for Dr. Spotfire office hours on the TIPCO community, or just Google it. So with that, let's get started. So Mathew is the CEO of Glysade. I hope I pronounced that right. And it's an analytics software developer company. He uses a Spotfire and the Spotfire SDK very extensively. So in essence, the SDK is another way to extending Spotfire capabilities. Remember that Spotfire is not just a tool, it's a platform and can be extended in many ways. The SDK is just another way to extend Spotfire. And for that, Mathew will be showing what has he done with the SDK. Do you want to add a little bit more on that, Mathew, on the introduction?
No, I actually think you've covered most of it. I think it probably is worth clarifying that we're not talking code in this session. We're going to be demonstrating results that we've used the SDK to extend Spotfire.
Perfect. So let's go ahead and look at the agenda. So we have here the introduction, where we're going to learn what the SDK and which is just simply other ways to extend Spotfire, an overview of extending a Spotfire, and just very briefly show other ways to extend Spotfire through mods or IronPython and things like that. Then we're going to jump right into real life examples of the SDK in action. Then we're going to do some demos with the data function development IDE, future possibilities with the SDK, and then just a conclusion and wrap up. So what is the Spotfire SDK? The SDK is, again, it's a software development kit. That's what SDK stands for. And it's a set of tools, API, and libraries that enable developers to extend and customize the functionality of a Spotfire platform. You can create custom data connectors, plugin, custom functions, visualizations, data panels, new extensions, and it uses the .NET programming language. So you need a development environment, Visual Studio, and you need to also compile, debug, and package for deployment. So there are other ways, as I mentioned, to extend Spotfire. SDK is one of them. Other ways to expand Spotfire is through IronPython scripting. And this is useful to configure and automate tasks. IronPython uses the same API or that the SDK uses, and we'll go over that very briefly in the next slide. Spotfire Mods is another way to create new visualizations. You can also create visualization with the SDK, but there are some differences as well. If you're interested, we can cover that as well if we have time. Then we have data functions. You can extend the Spotfire functionalities with data functions creating code in R or Python. Automation services is a no-code multi-step task automation. You think of it as a macro type of thing. JavaScript, you can enhance the user experience using text areas, but you can also use JavaScript API to create mashups and embed the Spotfire web pages to interact with other web applications. And then you have the Java API. This is actually another way to extend and customize when it comes to authentication, information server. So there are many ways to expand Spotfire, and each of them serves a different purpose. So I was talking about the SDK and the API. So what's the difference between extending with IronPython and the SDK? So the SDK, all of them go through an API. But when you go through the SDK, then you can create these custom tools or visuals or custom data sources, things like that. You have a custom service, maybe a web service API, and or calculations, data functions, and things like that you can create. So IronPython also uses the API, but it interacts directly to the Spotfire client, and you don't have to compile or anything. It's just you run the script in a text area, and that's it. But they both share the same API. And that's all I wanted to mention about that. There's another worth mentioning slide when it comes to, okay, so when do I use IronPython and when do I use C# extension? Well, it really depends on what you're trying to build. With IronPython, well, it's easy to extend, it's faster development time. You can have the scripts directly into the text area and trigger trigger those functions with clicks and document properties, but it's more for writing user interactions and controls to enhance the user experience, the user interface. Whether the C# extensions alone is maybe there's a gap there when trying to do these things with the C# extensions. And here I have some items that will be more appropriate when it comes to IronPython. And when we're creating a C# extension, then you can go into the guts of Spotfire and interact with many aspects of it. Custom visualizations that maybe when creating mod, which is another way to extend Spotfire when it comes to visualizations. Maybe you have some limitations there, but here with the SDK, you have more powerful, more freedom to do more sophisticated visualizations. But with mods, you cannot do data sources or other things, but with the C extension, you can. And so it's a different purpose of the IronPython. It focuses more on extending the Spotfire client itself, and you can see here the example that I mentioned before. Okay, so with that, I'm going to let Matt continue from here, and maybe share his experience from using the SDK and how long he has been working with the SDK, some challenges and some. The floor is yours, Matt.
Thank you very much, Jose, and thanks a bunch for the invite. It's great to be able to reach out to the wider TIBCode community and show off some of the stuff that we've been building. So by way of introduction, I should talk about Glysade at least briefly. So I've been writing extensions for Spotfire since 2010, and I co-founded Glysade with a couple of extraordinarily talented partners in 2015. And we've been writing extensions for Spotfire ever since. And most of the extensions that we write are in service of drug design in life sciences. Although along the way, we've created some general purpose tools in addition to the sciencey stuff that we normally work on. And that's kind of what I'd like to focus on today is both how we use the SDK and the kinds of things that we can create with the SDK. So let's go ahead and jump in and show off what Glysade has been able to build using the SDK. So on this page, I've got two visuals configured, the standard Spotfire bar chart and a Venn diagram. The Venn diagram is what Glysade created. And I should point out right off the bat that a lot of the development that we do is very similar to what you do with mods. So this visual was created with JavaScript, well, TypeScript, but it's effectively the same thing. So it kind of begs the question, why didn't we use mods? In fact, I looked around for a Venn diagram created with mods, and I think it might be a little difficult to build a Venn diagram using mods simply because of the way that mods works. And the difference here is that we were able to build a little bit of logic behind the scenes or behind the visual that handles the set intersections. And that's the bit that's a little bit difficult to do with mods simply because it's not built in. So we use the SDK to build that part. So the Venn diagram itself is, well, at least it behaves in many ways as a standard Spotfire visual. If I mark data over in the bar chart, you can see that it highlights areas inside the Venn diagram. And the Venn diagram responds to filtering exactly like you'd expect. So I'm going to point out the two numbers here. The first number is the total number of rows in this set, West region. And you also notice that when the mouse is static, a tooltip pops up and it shows the row count, but the row count is just for this section of the set, West region. If I include all the other sections of the West region, the subsections down here, you can see the row count for each of those sections. So going back to the interactivity, if you watch this number on West region, if I filter out the West region, notice that the number goes to 0. So both filtering and marking respond exactly like you'd expect for Spotfire visuals. Now, it's a little difficult to see in the fixed layout mode that I'm starting with here in the Venn diagram when the visual responds to filtering. So let's go from fixed layout and notice everything we drew here. Now we have a dynamic layout. So the dynamic layout attempts to represent both the sizes of the sets that have been chosen and the intersections of the sets that have been chosen with, the appropriate size circles in the intersections that you'd expect based on those sizes. So with a dynamic layout here, you get a much better feel. Notice the grocery stores is 520 for the total set. West region is 215. Cash cows is 151. And by the way, I'm using the standard sales and marketing presentation. That's one of the demo files provided with Spotfire. So we've got a dynamic layout. You get a very good feel for what the data set sizes are and what the intersection sizes are. And if I want to explore some of these intersections, I can just click on this area of the chart and notice it marked all of the rows in this intersected region. So when I do that marking, I'm marking all of the grocery stores that are cash cows in the West region. I can also do control click, so this is just left mouse click, and I can add other sections of the Venn diagram to the marking set selection. So it's the kind of interactivity and the kind of exploration that you'd expect out of the Venn diagram, where you can use the sets that have been defined and the intersections to interrogate the data as you normally do with Spotfire visuals. So let's go back and define one more set just to make this a little bit more interesting. You notice that the sets that I've defined so far here are all defined using the Spotfire expression language. So that seemed to be the easiest way that we could come up with to control the set selections in the Venn diagram. And adding a set is very straightforward. We simply click the button to add set, open up the Spotfire expression language dialog, and I'm going to define a new set that is store type other, because I know that's in the data set. And let's put a label on this. Let's say other stores. Now notice, because we're in dynamic layout mode, we've got a fairly accurate representation of the intersections of these sets. And with 4 sets defined, and we can go up to 5 sets, we can start to ask interesting questions like, well, I'd like to see all of the grocery stores in the West region that are cash cows. Clicking there marks those rows, and you can see the bar chart for the West region lights up with the marked rows. And there are lots of interesting questions that you can ask, and with the control click marking, you can define sets at will. So it's a very intuitive way to explore the data, given how easy Venn diagrams are to understand. So I'm going to pause there just in case there are any questions. And Jose, you can let me know if I should go on. I've lost your audio. Are you on mute?
Yeah. Thank you. I was muted. So we have a question from Mr. Khan, and he's asking if there are any examples templates to start from. And so let me share my screen and show you that there are actually some templates. I download the SDK from the TIBCO community, from the eDelivery website, and the SDK looks like this. Make sure that you have the div keyword here on the file so I unpack that, and the file contains the binaries, the package builders, and so on. And then we have examples folder. If I expand the examples folders, I can see many examples to start with, or templates when you use Visual Studio. Don't confuse Visual Studio with Visual Studio Code. There are different IDEs. I don't believe you can create stuff with a Visual Studio with Visual Code. But with Visual Studio, you can start off with these templates, and you have custom visualizations. Let me just switch to these other. Hold on one second. I have it here, so I can maybe zoom in, so you have a better look. But look at all these examples that we have: custom tools, custom visualizations. Data functions, connectors, you name it. there are many, many examples included in the SDK when you downloaded it.
In fact, I'd like
let
to
me also,
throw,
now that, sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to throw in a plug for the SDKs. I have learned a tremendous amount about the SDKs from looking at those code examples. It's a great way to learn, and even after working with the SDK for 13 years, I still end up referring to examples every time, several times a year. So definitely go check that out if you're interested in using the SDK.
So that brings another point that I have this slide prepared just to compare about Spotfire Mods and Spotfire SDK. And you will not notice in this slide that they are different purposes. But one of the things that I want to point out is here that the Spotfire Mods are fairly new since version 10. This was 2020, whether the SDK was available since version 2 of the Spotfire back in 2007. So that's more than 30 years ago, and we have the difference between one and the other. Okay, you want to continue, Matt, with the next demo?
Of course. Okay. The next example I have here is a trellised details panel. And so I have two visuals configured here. I have a table plot and the Glysade trellis details panel. And I have the table plot open simply so the trellis details can respond to marking. So let me mark a few rows. And now you can see that, sure enough, we're responding to the marking in the other visual exactly like you'd expect. I simply have it, the trellis details set to show all when nothing is marked. That's why you see a full page of details here when there are no markings in the table plot. So the trellis details, it's kind of interesting to be used with other visuals. If you want to look at a whole bunch of information for particular rows, the trellis details, consolidates and encapsulates a lot of data for each row. So if we just mark a few rows here, we can see that, depending on the content or the design of the details panel, and that's really the important point about the trellis details, is that these, or each of the individual cards in the trellis details, you can design the form layout for them. So I'm going to go to Edit Current Form, and this is now an editable form. So I'm going to start off by, let's try to make a little bit more efficient use of space. Let's set the size down to 300. And let's shrink the bar chart down a little bit. And we should be able to shrink this grid down a bit as well. So that takes up less space. And now we can edit the contents of what's in the grid. So we don't really need the comments. Let's select out region, city, and state. So now we've filled in the contents of the grid. We can also set the label here. So let's say that this is column. Okay, and everything automatically updates. So now we've got a much better use of space in the form. And I'd just like to point out there are a bunch of different of these controls. This is a grid control. This is a chart control. We can add a column data control, which is just a slightly different layout from the grid control, or we can remove that. And there's also, you can add an image or a table from a related table. There are lots of ways that you can lay out these form views. And when I hit save and return, we come back and notice the form has now been updated. So now we can do things like, oh, if I want to select a whole bunch of rows, in fact, let's just remove all selections. And let's say I wanted to use one of the details panel or cards as a reference. I can fix this item, and I can fix some other items. And now I can scroll through the other details, kind of looking at how they appear relative to references. So there's just a splitter in the visual here that separates the fixed items from the dynamic or marked items. But it's a very handy way to see the details for a whole bunch of rows simultaneously, as opposed to just looking at one row at a time. The other nice thing about this form definition or form view is it's kind of pervasive in a bunch of different places in the visuals that we've created. So of course, this is the trellis details view. We have a single details view or something that's very similar to the built-in Spotfire details view. But you can cycle through with the kind of VCR type controls. But we can also use these defined forms in tooltips in various visuals. So it's something that we have reused in all of the places where we thought it was appropriate. So again, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions that we should address before continuing. I think you're muted.
Thank you. I don't have any I don't see any questions, so please feel free to just ask questions as you might feel fit. But I have a question of my own. So it seems that very powerful visualizations, and how popular that visualization is. How long did it take you to create? What was the the process overall, or your experience building that table plot? A lot of interaction with the customers, I suppose.
Very much so. And those are great questions. Thank you. So, I should probably preface this answer with the folks in life sciences have different demands or use Spotfire kind of differently than a lot of other industries. So it's very telling that by far, the most used plot in Spotfire is the table plot in life sciences, which I don't think would be true in a lot of other industries. I think probably the second most used plot is the one I just showed, the trellis details view. We call it a gallery view, but it gets the idea across of what you're trying to accomplish. So in drug discovery, you're doing kind of traditional analytics from the standpoint that you've got an enormous amount of data with the compounds that are undergoing design toward becoming a drug. And you've got to tabulate all that information and refer back to it, and the details matter. And that's where I think the row level data visuals end up being so useful for life sciences. But of course, the standard details panel already exists in Spotfire, so this is really just a takeoff or extension of the idea that was already there, but we adapted to the demand of the folks in life sciences where they needed to be able to look at, multiple rows simultaneously and all the details of those rows. We developed the details view initially, the trellis details view initially, and one of the first customers that had access to it set about creating a details view or a defined form that filled an entire page. In fact, I think we might have had to add scroll bars just because their form ended up being so large to capture all of the row level data that they were interested in. and being able to pull data from other data tables, that it was kind of a surprise to us that what they wanted to do with it. So the development itself, I think it probably only took a couple of days to put that first version together. So there's no question that working with the SDK is more involved than working with mods. I think that's one of the huge advantages of mods is that, especially if you've got templated code or library code, it's really easy to integrate into Spotfire. We don't have the same luxury. But then again, the trellis details view requires row-level data access, especially if you were working with a data table of 1 million rows. It would be really difficult to get row-level data access. And again, that's something that we built in using the SDK. So it isn't terribly difficult to write these visuals once you have a fair amount of experience. And we have tried to make it as easy as possible for ourselves by creating a tool that's really much closer to JSViz than it is to mods. That's what the trellis details and all of our visuals are written on, is a central library that contains all of the extended functionality that we need to add to enable these visuals. And they do, the visuals end up morphing over time with customer suggestions. And in fact, at least half of what I'm about to show in the next section, these were all customer suggestions that drove the development of the visual.
That's very good. I have a question from Pseudo Analytics that says the Spotfire is the Spotfire generally available as part of the Spotfire server setup only. Is there any other sources available to download? So there's more to that comment from the same user that says, I feel that this area of Spotfire is very less explored because most of the community is not having access to the SDK itself. Okay, so that's a fair question. I think it's a good suggestion, good observation. And my answer will be that it's a great idea. There might be other companies that make their solutions available on GitHub as an open source, or maybe a mix of both, but I'm not aware of any of that. But that's a good suggestion. Maybe we're going to think about having a place to have those templates for the SDK ready. But I feel also, yes, you're right. The community, not only because they don't have access to the SDK, but because the group that uses more for self-service analytics is reduced. So that's why the Spotfire mods were came into place, because it's lightweight, easy to develop with its limitations, but it can solve many analytical problems through visualizations. Any comments on that, Matt, on that questions or suggestions?
I think we should both be fairly straightforward and say that the SDK does take there's a learning curve to it. And to be fair, I said I started in 2010. And when I started, TIBCO offered classes on using the SDK, and I used the intro into the SDK class that helped get me started. The online resources to be able to get started these days are far better. And from what I've seen, you could easily follow the recipes online. It really just takes a bit of elbow grease. And if you're thinking of going down that road, look, IronPython is really an excellent place to start. The SDK allows you to do things that you can't really do quite so easily with IronPython, but at least you get enough familiarity with the API that it's a very natural transition to jump from IronPython to working in SDK.
Yeah, I have another comment. It's asking if the IronPython accesses a lot of the SDK as well. So as I showed on a previous slide, let me go back to that slide real quick and show you this high-level architecture between IronPython and the SDK. So this is what I was talking about, that the SDK and IronPython go through the same API to access the Spotfire client. But the SDK through the API, you can build all of this stuff when you go through the IronPython. It goes directly to the Spotfire client. And if I go to a previous slide, I can see that. The next slide. They serve different purposes. So when you are more into guided workflows, analysis automation, or simple automation or specific business logic, you can do it with IronPython fairly easy. You don't need to compile anything or anything like that. And when it comes to C# extension, is more going to the weeds of the Spotfire, and anything that you can do manually with the Spotfire, you can automate with the SDK, such as custom data sources, custom visuals, custom tools, panels, generic business logic that can apply for everyone. So that's the type of things that you can do, or the difference between C# and IronPython. All right. Well, let's continue with the next portion of your demo, Matt.
Yes, thank you. So this visual on the top here, I've got 3 visuals configured: scatter plot, map chart, and a table plot. But this is the Glysade table plot. And I freely admit that it seems a bit strange to show off a table plot, but the root of why I'm doing this is the comment that I made earlier, that the table plot is likely the most used plot in life sciences R&D. And because of that, we've had users that have pushed, made suggestions and pushed the development of the table plot in directions where it can do some kind of remarkable things. So I thought I'd show some of those remarkable things off. Let's start off with editing data in the data table. So I've used the right mouse to open up the context menu, and right here you can see edit, enable editing. So if, for instance, there was a mistake in the data that was pulled down, I can just double click on the cell and say, oh, this was really a Northeast region store. And notice both the data and the color rule for that column were updated. And we've tried to make this as natural as possible and fit in the Spotfire context. So, if I've got a numeric column and I wanted to edit this and I say something like other, well, there's an error that says integer required. So it respects Spotfire data types. And then we can shift out of editing mode. It's disable editing. Now the changes that I've made to the data table have become part of the data table. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jose, you did a Dr. Spotfire session on database write-back, did you not?
I did.
Yep. So you can think about how powerful it might be to be able to do interactive editing directly in a data table, and then coupled with database write-back, it would be a very simple and easy way for folks to modify data. And of course, you'd want to be careful about something like that because you want to make sure that the data integrity is maintained. But in some contexts, I think that would be a great combination. also easy to, if we get into editing mode, we can discard all edits, and notice that cell up under region. When I discard the edits, it goes back to the original data and it updates the color rule there. So let's take this out of editing mode and show a few other things. Oh yeah, part of the reason that I included two charts here, in fact, just watch the map chart first. If I mark rows in the table plot, you can see that the marking updates in the map chart. It doesn't in the scatter plot, but that's because I have a different marking configured. Now watch the scatter plot when I click the checkboxes in the row headers. You can see that the scatter plot updates with those markings. So yet again, that's kind of a nice thing to be able to do, is you can affect multiple markings simultaneously from the Glysade table plot. So let's unmark the rows here. I guess there was the easy uncheck all. I should have pointed that out. Let's minimize these plots down a little bit. So fixing columns. You can fix columns in Spotfire tables. I'm right-clicking on the column header menus, and you can see that when I scroll the columns, those columns stay fixed. And that's useful, but it's also nice to be able to do the same thing with rows. So let's fix a few rows here. And you can think about it, again, very similar to with trellis details. If you want to use rows as references, all you have to do is fix them to the top of the table plot. And then as you scroll, you can compare other rows to the reference rows. So let's unfix all, and we'll unfix the columns here. Now let's look at filtering for a second. So the column header menus, and again, I'm just opening that using the right mouse button to open up the column header menus. And I guess I should have pointed out earlier, we don't have the filter panel open on this page, but that's the nice thing about the table plot, is that the filters are built in. So when I start sliding the range filter around, you can see that we're filtering directly from the row header, or the column header menu. And also notice the dotted line here. That means that the row is currently being filtered. So we can also do things like, well, I don't really want a radio button filter because that only allows me to select one thing at a time. But I can change to a list box filter, and now I can filter by selecting multiple categories there. So it's just a nice handy shortcut if you're short on screen real estate and you don't want to have the filter panel open. The the column header context menus are very helpful to be able to do that. And if I want to undo the filtering, I can just undo the filtering in the header menus. We've done something similar with sorting. So if I add one sort column and then I want to add a second descending sort column and a third ascending sort column, notice the little numbers under the carets. Those are indicators of the sorting dependency order. And then you can, you could just click a couple more times and remove the sorting. We have other things that you can do with the table plot, like a transpose. So this is swapping columns for rows if you're thinking about matrix math. So notice that all of the column headers or the column titles are on the left-hand side here. And if I mark, it makes it really obvious what's going on. Each of these are a full row of data. Now, think of how much more information I have presented using the transpose view. And that generally is because you have less white space in transpose. So if the view that you're looking for with the table plot is, you want to look at individual rows at a time, but as much data associated with that row as possible, the transpose view is a great way to do that. And you can switch back and forth between standard vertical view and the horizontal transpose view, depending on how you're trying to view the data at the time.
So Matthew, I have a question for you. So you can keep that screen full screen. You can keep it full screen. Yeah. So when it's in editing mode or view only mode, will you have those same functionality available, or the functionality is reduced?
Oh no, all the functionality is still available. The reason we introduced a mode to do this, so I've switched into editing mode, I can go to transpose view, I can switch back. There's no difference in the functionality. It has far more to do with protecting the users from inadvertent edits. So in editing mode, because all I've got to do is double click a cell and it's now in editing mode, if you accidentally did that when you didn't mean to, it's better just to not be in editing mode. So if you don't worry about that, you can put a table in the editing mode and just leave it there, and it will present no restrictions.
Okay. And I also suppose the undo that is out of the box from Spotfire works when you do something that you were not intended to. It keeps track of the undo feature.
Yep, it will. We just kind of added the convenience functionality of discarding all edits. And again, a lot of the decisions that we made here had to do with protecting the data. So not only can you do regular undo and discard all edits, we've also made it very easy to get into editing mode by automating the copy of a data table. So there are some restrictions, and these are SDK imposed restrictions. The data table that you're working with has to be linked data. So if, for instance, you were to initially create a data table from a file and that was embedded data, there's a function when entering edit mode that offers the option of just making a complete copy of the data such that you only work on the data table that's a pure copy and leave the original data table alone.
Okay, sounds good. Let me see, I have a couple more comments, questions. It says one of them is, okay. I have a couple. I'm just trying to go through them real quick. And okay, let's start with this one. Is there a video tutorial or documentation how to set up the Visual Studio? Yes, the documentation when you download the SDK tells you step by step how to set up all of that. Very briefly, you have to point to that folder, to that file that you unzipped, and then you point to some binary so you have the templates ready from Visual Studio. Then we have this one. It says, are there examples of IronPython code that could be translated to C#? I'm not sure about that. There are transpilers, but I guess there are also wrappers in C# where you can take IronPython code and put it in C#. But I'm not sure. Maybe you know more about that.
We do that on occasion as well. We embed IronPython code into the C#. The answer that I'd give is that, look, if you already know the two languages, IronPython and C#, then the syntax differs so little between IronPython and C# that it's a relatively straightforward exercise to do the translation yourself.
Okay, perfect. Another question. Is the SDK available through the on-premise and enterprise cloud only? And it's not available through the cloud AAS. So the cloud Spotfire is a multi-tenant implementation, so that will be hard to manage if you create an extension and then you try to deploy it to that environment. Then you have to have the enterprise cloud or the on-premise. Next one is, I see mods are a great start, but I feel it should explore other directions too. For example, making IronPython mods or share packages, and Python visualization mods, Python visuals integrated directly. So that's a good suggestion. You can also put them in the ideas portals, ideas.tipco.com. And but thanks for the suggestion. Okay, you want to keep going, Matt? Do you have any other things to share?
Yeah, I think since we're short on time, I'm going to skip ahead. There was a lot more to show on the table plot, but we'll put videos up on YouTube that show some of the other features. And I'm going to go on to data functions. And I'm just going to give a really brief overview of data functions here. And
so these data functions are like a custom implementation of the data function that Spotfire has out of the box, where you go to data, create new data function, and then you start typing your code in R or Python, right?
Exactly. And, I think that I should really just make a couple of points up front. Yeah, the data functions here, from an SDK standpoint, we are writing proper data functions. It's just that we've put a front end on data functions, and we manage data functions differently than what comes out of the box with Spotfire. And again, this is driven by the folks in life sciences are just a little bit different from other industries. In life sciences, really, there's a large proportion of folks that can make use of the data functions that Glysade writes. So Glysade writes data functions in Python, and then we upload those data functions to a Git repository, and users configure the public Glysade Git repositories. And I apologize for all the sciencey stuff here. But I wanted to show you that this entire list of data functions are things that Glysade has written, and the Git client that we built into Spotfire pulls all of these data function definitions local, and we've put all this functionality in the data functions visual for people to access.
So now, all those data functions are coming from a GitHub repo.
Yep. In fact, we download. We have two public repos. One is the data function definitions, and I'll just execute a data function very fast so you can see what I mean. But we also have Python libraries. In fact, the Git client can be used to manage IronPython scripts in Spotfire. So it's a very flexible way that, if you're trying to use or trying to distribute source code, usually from scripts, to an entire organization, using a Git client is a terrific way to do that. And it's agnostic of the data type. So the Spotfire server can only handle some or certain data types. The Git client is completely agnostic to data types. So we're storing data function definitions as YAML files, which that's one of the reasons we didn't end up using the Spotfire server, is that I don't know of a way to manage YAML files on the Spotfire server. So I'm just going to execute this order by ID data function, and it does exactly what you'd expect. In this case, all my unique identifiers for data are in the store ID column. So when I click on the data function, it maximizes the visual and opens up the GUI for the data function. And here I'm going to select store ID, and I have some pre-canned IDs and I'm going to paste into the text area here. Say OK, execute the data function. The data function visual automatically switches to the results view, and this shows the results of my order by ID data function. The input column was store ID. The output column automatically switches to a filter for the output column. In fact, the output column over here, let's move it over the left and put it right next to store order. And if I remove empty values, you can see now I've got all the values that I originally pasted from this list. 2687, 2687. Now that isn't the order that I wanted. I could just sort on that column, but here's a great example of where we've integrated IronPython into the SDK. I can click this button, which is Run IronPython Script, and any IronPython associated with the order by ID data function will now execute. I click that, it runs, it finds the visual on the same page that has the output column store ID order, and it removes empty values, and it sets the sorting, an ascending sort on store ID order. So now all I had to do to see this list of store IDs and see that they're in the same order, 2687, 2687, 41, 41. That was a super easy way to filter down my table and sort it to the exact order that I'm interested in. And although time is short, so I can't show the entire thing, there is an entire, I shouldn't say IDE, there's a rad GUI tool that allows you to write these data functions and even insert the Python and the IronPython, package it all up, and be able to upload it to a Git repository such that users will be able to use the data function that they defined right from the data function panel. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jose, and see if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you, Matt. That was very interesting, and we can certainly see the power of using SDK to extend Spotfire capabilities in so many different ways. That last data function capabilities that you show off, it sounds like a very good way to develop, debug data functions and have them ready. So thank you very much, Matt. Thank you for the audience for attending. Here are some links that I'm going to also put on the video descriptions when this finish. You can see extending Spotfire using the SDK, download the SDK, a link for Glysade company, and also email if you want to get in touch with Matt. Then Visual Studio, this is the link for the free community edition and the SDK documentation. So the next slide is just a reminder that we are live every Tuesday on every month. Let me see, where is this? Okay, yeah. Just subscribe for future recorded sessions, and that's all I have. Thank you, everyone, for joining again, and see you next time.
Yes, thank you, everyone.